So today I'm going to be reading this from my friend Stephen Thomas Kirshner. You can follow him on Medium. I'm also on Medium, but I don't post stuff on Medium. But he posts things on Medium occasionally, and it's some amazing posts. I really enjoy talking to him. I have a series on my channel of the You Are What You Consume series, and have another video coming out. I don't know when I'm posting this one that I'm reading this, but I just had a conversation with him, a two-part. It's going to be at least two parts talking about the 1619 project, and I spent a lot of my time talking to him. He's a great guy. So this is something that he has written. I'm going to be reading you. The title of it is "Don't Let Our Opponents Take the Moral High Ground: The Motte and Bailey, a Strategy for Debate." Okay, getting into it. Okay, so I'll just be reading this and giving some comments and thoughts. These are things that I've had in conversation with him, and just he had a separate post about this on social media, and then he expanded on this. And I just wanted to read it to you because I also wanted to read it in his expanded way and see how he put it here. It has some graphics and things like that, and I think this is important to get this information out there. And maybe he'll eventually start getting his channel up and going and something, or maybe I'm okay with just reading the stuff that he really puts on. Gives me more content to put on. Okay, so don't let our opponents take the moral high ground. The Motte and Bailey and strategy for debate. Those who have talked to me lately know that I have become very fond of referencing the rhetorical device called the Motte and Bailey. It was coined by the philosopher Nicholas Shackle in 2005 and has been popularized throughout many writings. For those that don't know, this is based off of this type of medieval castle. And for those of you not watching the screen, there's a small little hillock, or I guess it's called a motte, and then the bailey is a small little circular. So think about a small encircled little village of sorts with some thatched huts and houses with a wooden fence around it, and also just a small tower where the gate comes in, and there's a what's it called? The moat. There's also a moat actually. So I don't know if it's supposed to be motte. I don't know if the motte is Motte and Bailey maybe. No, the motte is the actual mountain, I think. Okay, so there's a little motte. Moat. The name's wrong. There's a little moat dug around, or some hole dug around, some little valley dug around the wall of that bottom place, and behind that little moat or furrow also goes around a motte, and that motte with a wooden keep kind of has a small little castle on top of this little hillock that has a path down into the motte that also goes along with that fence. And I think there's also another gate back there, and that's on the higher ground, and that's more of a keep. And the keep is more of just like a castle, a small little castle, a small, more secure place, and things like that. Okay, the defense strategy for this type of castle went like this. The bailey was the economically valuable part where houses, farms, shops, etc. were held. The motte was where the noble lived, and was a strong point for defense. When invaders attacked the castle, they would often breach the bailey first, and the defenders would retreat to the motte. The motte offered them, I think it's motte. I could be saying this wrong the whole time. It could be like motte, but I think it's motte. The motte offered a place to rain down arrows, rocks, sometimes boiling oil, and whatever else it took to drive away or wipe out the attackers. The bailey could then be reclaimed. These castles needed both to function. Sorry. The baileys provided the space for the economy and residence, but the motte provided the best point for defense. No motte, and the bailey would be easily overrun. No bailey, and there was just an economically useless castle. Okay, so I think that's a good explanation of that whole situation. And it's a lot of cool things with Europe. Just the way different places developed in Europe was in part due to that warfare that was going on in the things. A lot of people who think that currently right now it's end of the world, 2020 is the worst year ever. You don't really understand history. Like Europe was shaped. The beauty and things that you see in the way the European countryside was in a large part shaped due to the war and the strife and the problems that were occurring during that time. These struggles have shaped humanity, and we've made it through a lot worse things, and with some positive things coming out of it. So that's something to think of. Okay, so what does it mean when it's used as a rhetorical device? Simple. The bailey refers to the more valuable, but often more controversial aspects of a belief system that are harder to defend. The motte refers to a far less controversial, but also less substantive, and easier to defend points. The person arguing needs both, as the Bailey is where the substance of their arguments and their true goals lie. The motte provides them with a fallback position when challenged. For example, a person may extol why socialism is great and why we should have it over our current economic system. I can respond by bringing up all the deaths under Mao, Stalin, Pol Pot, etc., the totalitarianism required to implement such a system, the fact that a gap between the rich and the poor always develops under these systems anyway, etc. The person can turn around and say things to me like, don't you care about the poor people? Don't you want everyone to have health care? Don't you want to end the racism that occurs in countries like the United States of America? And so on. We can all acknowledge that these are fair and reasonable questions, and most upstanding people want these things. However, this is just defending the motte part of the argument. So what to do in these cases? The best answer I have heard as of late, courtesy of Dr. James Lindsay, is seize the motte, don't let them have it, and nuke the Bailey out of existence. How do we do this? That is the topic of this essay. So these things. Let's go back up here a bit. He says he can acknowledge that these are fair and reasonable questions. I think, and I would say just as the question themselves, don't you care about poor people? I think most people do, and it's poor compared to who. Like in the United States of America, as I've mentioned before, I think pretty much everyone there is in the 1% of the world. If you look at an average, most of the people in general are in the 1% of known human history when it comes to access to certain things. When it comes to healthcare, I've said this before, the average American pet has better access to healthcare than most of the humans in the world. For sure, most of the humans that have ever existed. Don't you want to end the racism that occurs in the United States of America? We'd have to define what racism is there, because I know there's a lot of things that are racial and racist. The National Basketball Association happens to be something like 65% plus African American, like descendants of slaves. So is that racist towards all the Asians that are in there? The Latinos, I think, are something like 25% of the population. Are they 25% of the NBA? Is that racist? No, that's a racial thing. Just like the WNBA happens to be 32% of them are out lesbians. Is that sexist because it's not following what the actual society is, because you're like, oh, you're heterophobic, you should be 95% straight, just how it is in society. No, those things aren't there. But in the United States of America, racism means something else. But anyway, so that's the intro to it. Let me get back to the reading instead of going off on my things. Maybe I'll talk more at the end. Okay, so how do we do this? This is the topic of the essay. I would argue that we can easily make the economic case for what we advocate on just about everything. I would argue that we can easily make the economic case for what we advocate on just about anything, but our opponents will try to outmaneuver us by claiming greater moral superiority. We need to do a better job of making the moral cases for our positions. I will take several scenarios below and explain what I would say in order to seize the motte and destroy the Bailey. You can criticize an organization where one of the leaders is caught on camera saying, "We're trained Marxists," and your criticism is deflected as simply prejudice directed at a particular ethnic group. Said group is purported to help. As I stated above, point out how many have died under socialist regimes. The current death toll combined is at least 100 million, possibly more. Socialist regimes have killed more than fascist regimes by orders of magnitude, and certainly more than any other form of government that has ever existed. I've encountered many who think that Hitler was the largest mass murderer in history, and that's not right. He was number 3. This chart illustrates it well. And here is the chart. Click the chart to get it bigger here. And somebody commented and they said, when you talk about Hitler, Hitler might not actually, fascist, it was the Nazi party does stand for the National German Workers' Socialist Party. I think that could be wrong, some of the things in there. But there is a socialist aspect to it. So someone was saying like, okay, they kind of consider that some form of socialism. So you can make what you want out of that. But let's say which dictator killed most people, and the heart is little drop of blood is a million people. So Yakubu Gowon with his Nigeria from 1966 to 1975, total kills 1.1 million. Mengistu Haile Mariam, which is Ethiopia in 1974 to 1991. The kills are 1.5 million. Kim Il sung, which is North Korea from 1948 to 1994. The deaths is 1.6 million. Pol Pot from Cambodia, which is 1963 to 1981, kills 1.7 million. Ismail Enver Pasha, which is Turkey, in 1913 to 1919, kills 2.5 million. Hideki Tojo, and this is in Japan from 1941 to 1944, kills 5 million. Leopold II of Belgium, and this is from 1865 to 1909, kills 15 million. Adolf Hitler, which is Germany 1934 to 1945, kills 17 million. Joseph Stalin, is actually spelled with a Z and an F? That's kind of cool. It's better than what I normally see out there. I think I'll be going with that spelling. The Soviet Union, 1922 to 1953, kills 23 million. Mao Zedong, China, 1943 to 1976, kills 78 million. Now, just one more thing on this. It's just, to me, that is just, it says something about how much the communist, socialist type of ideology has control and has entered society and it says another thing about China, and it makes me kind of think of why the country of China is where the people of China are the way they are. They just had this recently. Look, this is in 1976 what this was saying. That Great Leap Forward, that thing. One of my friends, very intelligent, a very intelligent woman. She's an entrepreneur. She works at things. I was just like, do you know what the Great Leap Forward is? She's like, no, never heard of it. I'm like, you never heard of this? Why have people never heard of this? Why are people walking around and just saying they're communists, and that isn't treated in a similar way to saying I'm a Nazi, I'm a neo-Nazi? I think it should be the same, because the things that have happened in China are horrific. Horrific. This is like America, kind of how you look at America's like military spending, and then you look at the like last couple of countries, and it's like, okay, the top one is like more than the last ones. Yes, 78 million. I'm doing my math here. I think China itself, Mao Zedong, has more than all of these other guys on the list combined. Okay. Back to the reading. Ask why it would. I mean, these numbers. Ask why. I mean, that's a lot of people. That is a lot of people. Listen, yes, China still has, I think it's still the most populous country in the world. Imagine if all these people didn't die. Yes, I know if all these people hadn't died, it doesn't mean they would be alive now and replaced. Plus, it would be them added to all these other people, because people would have had kids, and the one-child policy probably wouldn't have come in. That's twisting numbers. But 78 million, and that's the people in there. So when you look at what the Chinese politicians are going through, they grew up through this point. Like 76. So pretty much every Chinese person in power right now was alive during the time 78 million of them died. Think about the mentality and the kind of person that would come out through that system. So their minds, the way they look at the world is entirely different. If Mao Zedong, somehow convinced himself that to control that system, it was okay for 78 million of, this was mostly his people. This was post-war, like 1943. There's some things in here with the war going against Japan and things like this, but most of this is post-war. Most of this is, majority of this is Chinese people dying. They're okay for their ideology, for Chinese people to die. For 78 million, let's say 50 million Chinese people to die, just on that kind of situation. How many do you think they care about people in your country, other countries dying for their own beliefs? It's not good. Okay, back to the reading. Sorry for that. It's just those are a lot of numbers. Every time I look at this chart and I think about these things, it's a lot of numbers. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of death. Okay. Ask why it would somehow be different this time. Why said people could make it work. Why it wasn't real socialism. And just more generally, why all the horrible consequences wouldn't pan out. We've had numerous experiments, and they've all failed in the same ways, so the burden of proof is on them. It's a whole topic in and of itself. But if they're going to complain about racism and other forms of prejudice under capitalism, it can easily be pointed out that there has been tons, and I mean tons, of persecution of minority groups under socialism. The Germans, Poles, Latvians, Bulgarians, Afghanis, Iranians, and the Jews in the USSR under Stalin. The persecution of black Cubans and homosexuals under Castro. The Catholics in Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh. The Vietnamese, Chinese, and Muslims in Cambodia under Pol Pot. The Asians, mostly from the Indian subcontinent, under Idi Amin in Uganda. The persecution of the Tutsi minority under the Hutu rule in Rwanda. The genocide of Bosnians and Croats under Milosevic in the former Yugoslavia. The murder of white farmers in Zimbabwe and South Africa in recent times, and the persecution of all sorts of religious groups in China from Mao to the present. Just off the top of my head. Again, burden of proof is on them to explain why it won't be different this time. Also, on the broader level, determine what the aims of said group are. Let's be very specific. Nice sounding words like justice and liberation sound good, but what do they mean in practice? If it's just things like ending the war on drugs and qualified immunity, I think we can agree those are noble goals. However, if it involves items such as forced wealth redistribution, ending the nuclear family, and other more controversial positions, call them out and criticize them. There's absolutely no reason these ideas, or any ideas for that matter, can't be questioned or criticized. One other point, ask the person to do this mental exercise. Let's say a minority group, like a Brazilian native tribe, decided to form an advocacy group. If one or more leaders were caught on camera saying, "We are trained National Socialists, Nazis, we are trained fascists," would you let that stand? I doubt anyone would. If they're going to argue that fascism is worse than socialism, then ask why and restate the points above. Or as someone put this mental exercise more humorously. If I founded a movement called the Society Against Strangling Puppies, and the aim of the movement was to end capitalism, install communism, create racial segregation, and end policing, what would you say to those who oppose me? Do you want to strangle puppies, you monster? Because that is literally the aim of Black Lives Matter. Go home, you pathetic weasels. I think that's a good way to kind of ask people, and that's the thing. I think people's actions rather than what they say but then also what they say is often just the things they say. They don't really. It just changes around. Have more on it. It frustrates me. What they clearly don't think. I clearly don't think they think what I think they mean by saying what they say. So okay, America is an awful place. Proceeds to talk about slavery, racism, and the theft of indigenous land. That's the next point. I would give charity to these points for sure, but they only tell part of the story, and to tell exclusively this story takes far too much for granted. There are reasons millions of people have come here, and have done far better than they could have in their own countries. Capitalism, even we don't have and have never had pure unadulterated free market, has lifted millions out of poverty in this country and billions worldwide. There are reasons why. With this one, with the capitalism thing, I would suggest, if you don't know about the terms, I have a video talking about the actual history of the term capitalism itself. And even with Stephen, we've talked about this, how, for me, like, I actually use free market. When I'm talking about capitalism, I'm talking about more like specifically free market capitalism, and I think that's what he talks about as well. But when most of the Black Lives Matter people socialists and people protesting and things like that, they talk about socialism, it is something else, and that might actually be more close to actually the origin of the term capitalism before some people like Rothbard came in and coined the kind of capitalism that is more towards the free market. So there is some complicated thing there. And as I mentioned before with my frustration with words, I think words should mean the things. So it's good to be more specific, and that's why I'm suggesting that it's possibly might be better to say free market versus capitalism. Okay, there are reasons why so much has been invented here. There are reasons America went from a backwards country to a modern-day superpower in just a couple of centuries. It's easy to take tons of good things for granted. if you have no idea where they came from and why. It's far easier to tear things down rather than to build them up. In fairness, I get where this narrative comes from. I would say that the root of this problem is that the country used to teach this jingoist, glamorized version of history. The founding fathers were portrayed as god kings, and their more negative aspects were whitewashed or ignored. In the older version of history, America could do no wrong. Unfortunately, thanks to people like Howard Zinn, more recently, the 1619 Project, American history went in the complete opposite direction. America became seen as this irredeemably evil place, responsible for not just many sins in its own territory, but also many of the problems worldwide. Works like Zinn's and the 1619 Project have been criticized not only by libertarians and conservatives, but also mainstream left-leaning historians, and even several classical Marxists. This is a red flag, no pun intended, as far as the scholarship is concerned. And while it is important to teach the bad as well as the good, it can be done in a way that is accurate and honest. There are other people's history books similar to Zinn's and books about slavery that are far more accurate, that don't distort to push an agenda. More broadly, I would say people have to stop this. More broadly, I would say people have to stop reducing this to a Manichaean struggle of black versus white, good versus evil, light versus dark, and learn to embrace both the good and the bad and realize that things often are not this simple. I think that's a good thing. On that, America's an awful place, and we think people still vote with their legs. People still go one place and not the other. Many of the people who say they hate the United States of America, they clearly don't mean hate like I would, because let's say I was standing in the rain and there was some shade right to the left, and I'm like, I hate standing in the rain, and all I had to do was sidestep to the left and be under the shade, then clearly me saying hate doesn't necessarily mean hate like what I think hate is. Hate for me is if I can avoid something by simply moving my location to the left, I would do that because that's something I hate. So clearly hate could be like, I dislike it, or there could be reasons of me currently being in that place where like, this sucks that I'm here, or I hate standing here. There could be something else that I think is more worthwhile. Maybe it's like, I hate standing in the rain and I really do hate it, but for some reason I'm confident if I keep standing in that rain for that, someone's going to give me $1 million, and I'm like, okay, I would prefer the $1 million. The chances of me getting those $1 million is better than just standing in the shade dry. So they must be things about the United States of America that even if they say they hate the United States of America, that it's the worst place, they don't mean worst. They mean it's like maybe the worst, but it's also there's other things. So that's kind of what I'm thinking with that whole aspect on that one. So moving on to the next point here. You legitimately criticize a person's ideas or policies, and the criticism is deflected with the defense that you're just attacking the person because of immutable identity characteristics. I've gotten this a lot, and I'm sure many of you have too. While we should acknowledge that bigotry does exist and call it out when it happens, I would point out that this sort of thing has become a lazy and dishonest way to deflect valid criticisms. The point of this is often to shut you up and put you on the defensive. Don't let it. Take the ideas apart and ask them what they like about the person. Take the ideas apart and ask them what they like about the person besides immutable characteristics and or party affiliation. Refute the ideas before attacking the person. Once you've debunked the ideas, burden of proof is on them. I would say, however, be consistent. If you criticize this person's bad ideas, you have to be just as critical when someone else espouses or does the same. Otherwise, you are treating said person unfairly, whether it be due to your own bigotry or for tribal reasons such as party affiliation. Now, this one is true. He might mention this because it's something he mentioned in his original post, but we have to understand that fields are fields. If you're on a field, like there's different places, stadiums. Let's say you go to a stadium, like, okay, today this is what we're going to do at the stadium. We're going to the stadium to watch somebody play a game. There's multi-use stadiums. Some stadiums have tracks around them. Some stadiums will have the actual pitch, the actual grass and things like that. But then there's different lines you can put on the field. There's different goalposts you can put on the field. Even with the track itself, if someone is running 200 meters, they will try to run those 200 meters and run it in a different way than somebody who's running a 1500 meter where they have to run around the actual, do multiple laps. You will gauge it in a different way. So if you're on that field and somebody thinks you're out there to watch a rugby game and somebody else comes out and thinks they're watching a track meet, but it's at the same stadium, you're not going to have a similar understanding to discuss what is going on or an expectation. Or if you're actually playing on the field, you actually get there. And I hope he doesn't mention this later on because I'm going into it now. I'll just skip over it if he goes into that part, my whole thoughts on it. But let's say you're actually playing and you actually say, here, we're going to go to the field to play this game. One of you thinks you're going to go play maybe rugby. The other person thinks you're going to go play football. And you say, okay, bring the actual equipment. Somebody might come to that field with different equipment, with a round ball, whereas the rugby guy will have that kind of oval type of eggish thing. You'll ask for different number of players. If you're like, okay, yeah, I need 7 people to play 7s or 15s to play 15s, so you'll call 14 friends or 6 friends. The other person will like, okay, I need 11 people because I'm playing football, so I'm going to call I'm going to call my 10 I'm going to call 10 friends. And then when you get there, okay, with the 10 can adjust down to 7s. But if somebody wanted to play 15s and they called like 14 friends and that person only called 11, like 10 because he thought it was going to be football, they're not going to be able to upgrade. But let's say you decided, let's just meet halfway and play 15, so then you can bring it down. So anyway, there's kind of things where you have to agree on what you're actually discussing. And once you've actually agreed on that, you should be fair and treat it as the same way. So that might have been a complete digression that was completely unnecessary at that point. But bear with me. Getting on to the next point here. Okay. Someone tries to guilt you for your identity or makes some accusation that can't be proven in order to get you, you to go along with them. Don't let them. You're responsible for what you do, what you say and do, not what every member of your sex, race, religion, etc. does. Trying to guilt you for these things is just a bullying tactic. This is a fundamental aspect of cult indoctrination. I realize it sounds hyperbolic to many at first, but it applies. This graphic lays it out well. And this is one thing that I will definitely say, looking at some of the things that are going on as religions, as cults, has made them make a lot more sense than I was struggling with things, and having come out of a religion, from being raised as a Christian and having come out of that, I was like, oh, phew, I'm out of this, and a lot of people are out of this, so like I can see like now the world, but no, there's other forms. Just like how religions existed before Christianity, before monotheistic, before that kind of structure of it, they have after. The line between cult and religion is pretty much acceptability. So that's the only difference with it. The content of itself, if some are more based on factual things and things that are evidence-based and things that are testable, but things in the past, comparatively to what was evidential and testable at that time, those were the things that were made sense. There's some things right now that we have that are the basis of certain set religions that we're like, look, this is the evidence based in facts and reality. That if you took those very same facts of reality about the world back to people thousands of years ago who didn't have access to that information, the technology that we have now that led us to this kind of knowledge, they would think you were completely absurd, even though you were actually more accurate to it. So that's just some of my thoughts on those kind of things. The current day religions don't seem like religions, but I think you look a couple of hundred years in the future, and when they're looking back, people are going to be like, yeah, that was a religion. That was a cult. Okay, the cult dynamics of wokeness. Cult indoctrinations tend to follow very predictable stages. First there is initiation, then there is indoctrination, and then there is reprogramming. Wokeness is a cult. It might even be, in its broadest functions, a proper religion with a describable and fanatic cult element. Anti-racism in particular, under its auspices, is explicitly framed religiously and with clear patterns of cult initiation written all over it. Part 1, Initiation. Exploit a core vulnerability. Vulnerability is often deliberately inflamed or manufactured for the purpose of doing a cult initiation. Would-be indoctrinators ask manipulative questions and try to catch people on the spot in a feeling of discomfort that is usually rooted in their morality and sense of being a good or adequate person. Did you know you're complicit in racist systems? Your objection to being called a racist is your white fragility. Resolve. I think it's supposed to be followed this way. Like I've had an issue where I've been reading a lot of manga, and then the manga is normally like right to left. So normally when I read things, it's normally like right to left when I read some things. So sometimes I'm like, okay, where do we go on this one? So this one, I think it goes down and then down there. So okay. Resolve. The vulnerability with the woke doctrine. Is it supposed to be this way? I don't know if he's going 1, 2, 3, and then resolve. Anyway, so I'm going to read 1, 2. I'm going to go with the resolve first. Okay. Okay. Resolve. The vulnerability of the woke doctrine. Cult doctrine is introduced as a way to resolve the emotional distress brought by the vulnerability. Okay, yeah, it's supposed to be that. Be an anti-racist. Help us dismantle the system and build a better world. Be an anti-racist. Help us dismantle the system and build a better world. Do the work. Okay, the cult indoctrinator makes the mark feel morally welcome and good. Now they're doing the right thing and where they were doing the wrong thing before. You're on the right side of history. Man, these people. Then they will deepen the doctrine while informing their mark that they'll be surrounded by temptation, especially from the broader society. This is the surest first sign that a cult initiation is taking place. It is when this warning starts being applied to the friends and family who will be described as failing to understand the depth and value of the cult's doctrine, and in the fact, the mark themselves. Okay, and let me reread that. Sorry, I'm all over the place with this reading. Apologies. This is the surest first sign that a cult initiation is taking place. It is when this warning starts being applied to friends and family who will be described as failing to understand the depth and value of the cult's doctrine, and in fact, the mark themselves. They're white supremacists. Yeah, that one is something that definitely happens. Okay, number 2, indoctrination. Deepen commitment. Usual cult deepening methods include public pronouncements of faith before the in-group community, which bonds the mark to them socially and emotionally, and sunk costs. This will often involve rituals such as group prayers, singing, or outright initiation rituals, which dramatically deepen commitment to the group very quickly. There will also be requests to make costly personal sacrifices to be considered a full part of the new group. When the mark is sufficiently committed to begin uncritically consuming massive quantities of the cult's doctrine, they are well into the indoctrination phase. They lose all trust in outsiders. Do the work! Anti-racism is a lifelong commitment to an ongoing process of self-reflection, self-critique, and social activism. Critical whiteness educator Robin DiAngelo. She's the one who's written that book that's recently going around called White Fragility, which is, from anything that I've heard, just a gem of just absurdity. And that is as dogmatic a book as the Bible or as the Quran or as the Torah. It's as significant to a religion as any of those. Okay, reprogramming. Reprogram an us versus them worldview. And you see this us versus them, this is in-group, out-group dynamics that work in general. This is part of how we develop. This is part of our Evo psyche. This is part of our society. This is part of the things. And some of those things have positive aspects. You should look out for your team. Just like if you're in a team, like I mentioned before with the team things, I should understand this is my team. We're trying to achieve that goal that this other team is also trying to stop us from achieving, and they have goals that they're trying to achieve that we are trying to stop them. So you get that. So I am not against the whole team dynamic. There is us versus thems, but it's just, is that a thing that is positive if you're considering us being a greater whole, where it's like, okay, after this, we are all going to actually be winning as a society, as a culture. Okay. So reprogram an us versus them worldview. Cult indoctrinators now try to make the Marx thinking get completely in line with the view of the world described by the cult doctrine. This will let the Marx see the truth of the doctrine for themselves everywhere in the world. That's being woke. In the cult of woke, the Mark now has a critical consciousness and is able to see the problematics in everything. This includes in speech, writing, institutions, thoughts, people, systems, knowledge, history, one's past, and society itself. Society is broken into different groups and classes, social group identity, that are oppressive on one side, oppressed on the other, and in conflict over this. That is conflict theory in the belief that different social groups in society are always in conflict with one another for power and dominance, and that rather than working together in complex dynamic ways, they can be mutually beneficial. That can be mutually beneficial, they are at war. Silence is violence. The question is not did racism take place, but rather how did racism manifest in that situation? So I think that's a good encapsulation of the cult dynamics of wokeness, and I think you can see these things. And I had a separate video talking about how the Christian right, the Christian political right in the United States of America, is one of the groups that is mostly aware of the actual cathedral, with the political left indoctrination of children, because they understand the powerful effect of actually indoctrinating children into Christianity. They understand that yes, as kids, you can shape them to believe these things that don't really have that much evidence, so they can see it when it's being done by the cult of wokeness. They can also see it when it's being done in the madrasas. The Jews, the Jewish communities, the people who actually believe those things in the religious sense of it, they also understand, yes, you teach this from the kids. I was recently just reading some books that I wrote, me and my brother wrote when we were in a Catholic school in 1994, so it's a long time ago. We're old people here. So it was a thing, and there was the religion classes, and being told what are the things we really believe, what are the fears that we don't have, what are the true fears that we have. We're like, okay, hell was like a real fear, yet the world ending every other day, like the world just ending today was not a fear that was an imagined fear. Yet you have right now people thinking the world's going to end right now. There's climate change, there's all these things, like the white supremacists and Trump is going to end the world. They're the ones who are currently thinking like, yes, that's not an imagined fear. To them, that is their hell thing. So it's kind of like slid over. So that's just something interesting with that. Okay, so, and to be clear, this formula does not just apply to politics. It applies to religion, social groups, and other things. And yeah, I'm not surprised that you wrote this, because we've had conversations with Steven, and we kind of agree on some of this content. Okay, next point. I'm all about science. Unlike you, I believe in science. Well, does the person saying this actually believe in science and apply its methods evenly and consistently? Or are they cherry-picking science for when it's convenient / fits their narrative? Now, in matters of religion, science doesn't apply, I realize. But in matters of fact and argumentation, it's absolutely required, especially if the person claims to be an atheist. I say this because even many atheists today abide by worldviews that are fundamentally religious in nature. James Lindsay came up with a graphic that nails this. Okay, so here is something, and I also have a different video talking about the science versus the scientific method. Okay, how to tell science from what is not science. A simple primer. This is if you're not looking at the screen, this is at Conceptual James for the person who posted this, but this is posted again on Steven's article here. There's a pyramid triangle, and the top triangle is required, falsifiable claims. And these top two sections are in what is considered science. So, as I said, required, the top triangle. At the very top, falsifiable claims are required for it to be scientific. Important. Experiments can be reproduced by anyone. The feasibility uses strong statistical evidence. Objective standards. These are important. So I think important, if you said falsifiable claims, I think that's already it. Important, these are things that are, I think you have that required one, then okay, you have one of those. Because if you have falsifiable claims, then an experiment can be reproduced by anyone. But then something that's scientific that can't be reproduced by everyone is something like, I can't just go and be like, build my own CERN Hadron Collider and be like, okay, I'm going to try to recreate this small little atom that you say has actually been created and things like that. I can't just be like, okay, Yeah, so Elon Musk has invested all this money into SpaceX, and he says this works, and he's like, look, he's shown me with this film that the rocket actually lands. I can't just be like, I'm going to build my own SpaceX and test that or something. So there's some things where it's kind of tough to reproduce. But if I had access to those resources and the time, I should be able to reproduce the actual things. Strong statistical evidence. With statistical evidence, I think you can use statistics for different things by limiting certain things, but the evidence is the evidence. The evidence isn't different because I'm not as good as collecting it, or the evidence hasn't changed because I decide to report only part of it, if that makes any sense. Objective standards, I think that's one thing that's clearly, there are things that are subjective, but that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about science. And defeasibility just means it's something that can actually be, it's something that can be discussed, can be corrected, if it's something that can be tested. So you can't just make a claim and be like, okay, there is an invisible spider drinking this from this teacup behind the moon that nobody can see or detect. That is an unfeasible. Is it defeasible? There's a comment that you can't really test because I'm saying it is beyond testing. So there's no actual, it's not scientific. It's not a scientific statement. It's not based on science. It's not something that can be subject to the scientific method because I'm saying it cannot be tested. So that's what the defeasibility thing is there. Okay, not science. The first section here is sophistry, political slogans, name calling, red herring fallacies, argument from authority, superstition, other ways of knowing, clapping emojis. I like you include the clapping emojis. Yeah, that is normally where I was like, oh, come on now. Oh, what's the clapping emojis? Okay, the last section here is anti-science. Now, sophistry is kind of like, I think the sophistry stuff are the ones that I think I would add DPDs there, which is something that Daniel Dennett said. That's something that sounds profound to begin with, and when you hear it, there's actually nothing really there. So I think with sophistry, things that most people get swayed by that. And I think on average, your average person that is not necessarily so involved in some of these things falls for the sophistry, not anywhere as close to they fall to anti-science things. And these are the anti-science ones here. Okay, gaslighting or emotional abuse, white fragility, imprecise, vague language, standpoint theory, lived experience, narratives slash storytelling, religion slash faith, witchcraft slash sorcery slash magic, Kafka traps, language manipulation. Okay, so maybe the average person does fall for some of these things, because would you still consider the average person in the world to be religious? As I've mentioned, I'm saying religions go past just the regular theologies, the most popular theologies, and that what we define today. When somebody says religion, people normally think of theology, yet religion itself is more expansive than just theology. For example, Buddhism, and I think even something like Jainism, those are religions, but they're not theologies because they don't have the belief in a higher supernatural God being, which theologies do. So yeah, that's just kind of my thoughts on that. Okay, so don't let anyone claim science, or what does he say here? Learn the principles and the graphics and make sure they apply to your own thinking as well as your opponents. And yes, for me, these are things that it's taken a while for me to go to the self-knowledge and get myself out of these. I used to just live in these bottom two sections, and now I try as much as possible when I'm talking to people and discussing serious issues to be in these top two. Okay. So don't let anyone claim science without abiding by these principles. If they start using things on the bottom half or so, call them out as invalid. And that's the thing. You can still go with political sloganeering. I can hear Trump say, "Make America Great Again," and understand that's a political slogan. I can hear Obama say, "Yes, we can," and understand that's a political slogan. Because yes, we can. Yes, you can make America great again. But what do those mean? That leaves a lot to be filled in. Yes, we can do what? What is America? What is making America great again? But that is what politics is about. Religion and faith has places in some people's minds, not as much in mine. In my life, I try to be as little based on those things, but for some people, they have certain purposes, and I can understand there is something with the community and things like that, but I think you can find better ways to get those things solved. But I don't think religion and faith should be the basis for making a scientific claim about something. Yet, these things might have some things. White fragility, that has nothing to do with me, but at least for Robin DiAngelo, It's a way to make a living. She's just getting rather wealthy based off of this thing. So there are aspects, narratives and storytelling for me. That's my jam. I'm a creative, so I like telling stories. I like telling narratives. I create art and things like that. I write scripts and do so. With that one, I can understand there's a purpose. I enjoy books. I enjoy like hard sci-fi and things like that. And those are things that teach me, and they can teach you certain things. But it is not fact. It is not reality. So I do understand that aspect of it. Okay, so next section. Thank you. Oh, and again, thank you. Not again. This is the first time I think I've thanked you, but thank you for listening to me. I don't know how this is going to go. If it's going to go a straight read or spend some time. I'm not sure how long I'm recording, but thank you for coming along so far, and let's keep going. Okay, cites comedians for information and then backpedals when challenged. Usually with something like, "This is just comedy. It's not real news. This is something that drives me insane. And I could probably write a whole piece on this alone." I hope he does. And if he does, I probably shall come back and read it. Something is either serious information or it's entertainment. It can't simultaneously be a reliable source of information and just satire. If the person uses the "it's just comedy" excuse, ask them why they rely on it for information then. Unless, of course, it is a source of credible information, which means it should be scrutinized like anything else. I used to be, I think 6, 7 years ago, the kind of person who's like, I don't watch the news. I just watch The Daily Show. That's when Jon Stewart was still on. So I think it's earlier than 6 to 7 years ago. Once he left, I kind of watched it less, but I would go back and watch older clips. I'm like, this is a lot more informative. But even at that time, if he said something about a story that I was like, oh, that is absurd, I would often go and find an actual news source. Now, most often that news source would also be like CNN or MSNBC, some places that now have turned into worse than the Daily Show type of thing, worse than BuzzFeed type of thing, just total mean girls, just kind of just some most absurd stories. So anyway, so that was my process. So, and that helped me get out of actually going there and even having that thought where it's like, at least they're bringing up the thing. That's a thing where they bring up things to raise the conversation, but the conversation should not end there. They're accurately discussing and pointing out issues, but it's very scripted, it's very chosen to pick the issue, and that is also something that happens on other news channels. There is bias and things like that. But when you actually go to a comedy thing, and in particular here, if you just watch it and you laugh at Trevor Noah right now and you're like, oh, that's cool, but then when you actually go and you say, this is the actual news, this is more news than the news, then in a way, you're not entirely wrong, because the news is what is in general called the news is as contrived, almost as contrived as I mentioned, has maybe gotten worse than even what the Daily Show was back then. As it's as contrived, as manufactured, as marketed to sell you a certain product, to sell you a certain point of view, indoctrinate you in a certain way as a comedy show. The comedy is normally meant to make you laugh. This stuff is normally meant to make you cry. It's like the tragedy and comedy, how those masks are kind of together when the whole like plays type of thing. That is something where you can see that there is that together. Or hey, let's laugh at Trump. Oh, let's be in this. What Trump has done is completely tragic, or it's just completely hilarious. There's no middle ground. So there is that kind of aspect where the news itself, news is still news. Actual reporting still exists. If you actually want someone to actually give you information about what has actually happened, that actually probably exists more today than ever has in the past, since you can live stream things that are actually going on. You can go find the actual sources. Very often, if somebody's reporting in a story, they might be in the news right now. What they normally do is one person releases something, then somebody else posts their article based off of this, embellishes it a bit, adds their own editorial spin, then somebody else comes in with that and adds their editorial spin, and then like the fourth person will quote all three of those people and say, yeah, look, 3 different sources have said this about this thing that actually happened, when those 2 other sources before were just re-quoting something that that first person, who might not even have been there to begin with, said about that one situation. Then you read that 4th source and you're like, oh man, that's the Washington Post. They have 4 sources from different people who said different things, or that's the 4th source and these are 3 other people. So that's 4 sources I have about this thing actually happening in this kind of way with that editorial spin. And then you go forward and you're like, wait, no, that's actually not what happened, because that person was actually there. And I personally have experienced that by actually attending events and then looking at how they're reported on, watching things live and looking at how they're reported on, being in certain things, and just it's something that I ask you to do. If there's live speeches, if there's live events, if there's actually something occurring, Go check that thing out, and then for the next 2 days, go and see how it's reported on from different people based off of what you've actually experienced yourself. Okay, so next point. This is correct or incorrect because this person with an advanced degree in X says so. This was mentioned briefly in the science graphic above as argument from authority, a common logical fallacy. This needs further examination. We have plenty of experts on our side. I could run off a long list of people I've learned from with PhDs, whether it be in philosophy, history, economics, etc. Don't their voices matter too? If our experts are dismissed on the basis that said people disagree with them, they're proving that they don't really care about credentials. They're just team signaling. Now let me be clear on this fallacy. What matters is the arguments themselves that the experts are making. We claim something is right just because said experts say so. We're making the same mistake. With this one, I think he's said pretty much all that needs to be said on it. I'll just add this part on it. My example is, I've also mentioned this with like a parrot. A parrot can literally speak. A parrot can say words, can hear words and repeat the word based on certain cues. Doesn't mean the parrot thought of that concept or that word, it's just repeating it. A computer itself can literally just have audio coming out, have words on it. Doesn't mean the computer itself made up the thing. So is the computer an authority? No, it's still just a thing. So the presentation of the material should be the material. Is the material factual? Is the material important? From the source has a very minor aspect of importance for me, because I have gotten information from so many different sources that I think the actual source itself, it should be the information that's more important. Okay, a few closing points and some responses to debate tactics. I wanted to address a number of debate tactics I see these days that are often used on their own, or in some form with the Mott and Bailey. They were sort of touched on in the science graphic above, but I thought they deserved further elaboration. First one, establish goalposts in advance and be very specific about definitions. It's common for people in debates to shift the goalposts, meaning they change the criterion for the terms of the debate while it's happening in order to avoid being proven wrong. In my experience, the way around this is to formulate clearly in advance what the terms of the debate are and what words mean. This is what I went on with that aside above. Quick example. We're having a debate about capitalism. I would go with the standard traditional definition of capitalism as an economic system characterized by private and corporate ownership of capital goods, by investments that are determined in private decision, and by prices, production, and the distribution of goods that are determined by competition in a free market. Now, I think on average, if you ask people to define capitalism, they would not say something like that, which is unfortunate to me, but that is what I kind of mean when I used to use the word, but instead I'll just be talking about, if I use it, it would be couched by saying free market capitalism in specific. Okay, so this definition doesn't include slavery, mercantilism, government cronyism, and numerous other things involving the state. So a person can't tie these things in to criticize or reject what I'm talking about. I lay down my goalposts. No changing terms or redefining words mid-debate. A friend of mine likes to say, it's not even clear that some people even have goalposts when debating. They just change what they mean, want, and striving for as things go. And the friend is me. The conversation we had the other day. And I'm trying to think of the current term for that. Is it post-goalpostism or post-postism? Post-goalism? I'm trying to think of what it is, because there almost is no goal. There is no goal. It's like that. It's like that thing from The Matrix with the spoon, where the spoon is being bent. How do you bend this? There is no spoon. I was like, how do you bend this conversation of those words in that way to get to that place? There is no goal. Like, it's not even the goalpost. There is no goal. That's this kind of situation is going with that thing. Okay, next one. Radical subjectivity. We've all heard these lines in debates. This is my truth. What's true for me may not be true for you. That's just your opinion, man, etc. While certain things are subjective by nature, subjective value is a fundamental aspect of Austrian economics, after all. while things are subjective by their nature, subjective value isn't a fundamental aspect of Austrian economics after all. Facts are facts. With Austrian economics, that's a school from the Mises, have separate videos on the Mises Institute. Both me and Steven would be considered, I think when we go to economics, I think with the Austrian School of Economics are the things that we consider rather valuable and as close to or as good as possible as anything else when you look at the School of Economics has been developed to actually make sense about the world. Something else might be developed after that to build on that, but I think that's the best thing that we have out there, and I would suggest anyone. If somebody told me, let's read one book on economics, on econ, I would suggest Man, Economy and State with Power and Market, written by Murray Rothbard, who is an Austrian economist. I think that it's an excellent tome of knowledge. Okay, if they are arrived at through sound methodology, it's always a weird word to use. Methodology just sounds wrong. If they are arrived at through sound methodology and can be verified, they can't just be dismissed on a whim. Radical subjectivity falls apart on so many levels. There's no such thing as a statement of absolute truth is itself a statement of absolute truth. The people who claim radical subjectivity are also convinced that their beliefs are the correct ones. But what is their basis for knowing that if truth is subjective? Does anyone live life by subjective principles or by the relationship to reality? If so much is subjective, aren't scientists wasting their time? Attacking motives and reading minds. There are various forms of ad hominem, or to the man in Latin, and I wonder in current year, is that considered sexist? Should it be to the individual in Latin? Should we change that? What is individual in Latin? And even with because individualism developed at that time, certain concepts like individualism and collectivism, in-group, out-group dynamics, those things have existed, but to be actually coined and identified as ideologies or thought lines or things that can be taught and critically analyzed is rather recent. Like people don't necessarily understand what individualism and collectivism is. So even some of these things like ad hominem, some of these things are rather recent. It's rather amazing to think of. Liberty. It's just amazing to think of how new these ideas are. It's a bright future for us. Okay, and shouldn't be taken seriously. Ad hominem should not be taken seriously. I personally want debates with someone who resorts to this off the bat. I agree with that, Stephen, and I don't think we should. However, to be clear, a personal insult can be thrown in with a solid argument, and that argument will still be valid. In fact, it's a sophist trick to claim offense, or even just feign it, as a way to avoid a valid point. For example, I agree with this because I am not beyond insulting somebody for saying something that is horrific or dumb. If somebody is outright racist and just says, you as a black person, I look at you as a black person, Silas, I identify you as a black person, and just because you're that way, it means you can't actually achieve this thing without my white help. I'm like, you're an idiot, and look, these are the things that I've achieved without your white help. These are the things that I've achieved despite other black people trying to keep me away from this. I am an individual. This is who I am. So by me insulting them and saying that they're dumb for saying that, or they're racist or whatnot, they could say, oh, you call me a racist? I'm not a racist, and then ignore all the evidence that I've given them that their point about me needing their particular white help is not true. Then that's the kind of thing. Like, look, my parents raised me in this way. These are the things that I've learned. This is the effort that I've done. This is the work I've put in. If I actually do X, Y, Z, I'll still achieve this. And if you do those X, Y, Z, you will achieve it too, despite you being white, despite me being black and your identification and all these things. They would ignore that because I call them a racist, because I call them dumb. Okay, whatever. Okay, so let's finish this off. But this ability to read minds that some people seem to claim to have when they say things like, they just don't like this person because I think they're bigoted. This person is bigoted and they don't know it. This person has unconscious bias, which does exist, but assumptions or assertions don't prove it. People disagree with me because they're mentally ill. People just feel uncomfortable by this, and statements that claim to be able to describe a person's mental state without proof don't count as refutations. Even if a person is mentally ill in some way, their arguments can still be right. This should be discarded without hesitation. I think that about wraps it up. Hope you enjoyed, and feel free to reach out if you have anything to add or to comment. And as I mentioned, he's here on Medium. He's actually requested that you could actually go in and check his stuff out and follow him there, and you can see the different posts that he's had. I might actually go back and read some of his older posts because he's done some other posts that I think are interesting, and I enjoyed doing this just as, not as much as I enjoy having the conversations with him, because the conversations, it's live and it's action and different thoughts and things come by. Like as you mentioned, the goalpost thing, it's an idea that I'd been mulling over for some time, and then in an actual back and forth conversation with him, in the conversation we had about the 1619 project, things came by. We're supposed to do it in a certain way, and then end up being like a 2 hour conversation. We didn't actually get to the actual initial analysis that he wanted to discuss to begin with, because we just went and broke it down part by part. But that's the kind of thing that has made my life just. I'm thankful to know people like him, to have access to this information of this human knowledge, these human information vectors, and this acquired ignorance destruction systems that we just have today, and the world will be a better place. So for all these things, that is something that I am rather confident about, and I think if you're listening to me and you've been listening for this long, this is probably something you would kind of sort of agree with as well. So that's it for now. Like, share, subscribe. Thank you for listening to this. Go follow Steven on Medium if you're on Medium. You can follow me on Medium too, but there's no point. I don't really post anything on there. Okay, that's it. Goodbye.